Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. I am going to be speaking about a heavy topic, the residential school system here in Oregon, which took children away from Native families for generations. So I've been giving talks on these schools for a couple of years now. And one thing I've learned from listening to and talking with Native communities is that it's really important to start out by explaining myself, meaning a little bit about who I am and how I came to this topic. So even though this story is definitely not about me, I do want to say just a few words about my background so you know why it's me here in front of you today. I am not Native. Just want to make that clear. I'm not here to speak for Native people. I can't represent their voices. My ancestors were Western Europeans. My earliest ancestors in America came over hundreds of years ago. Various branches of my family lived all over the United States. My family was among those who were doing the colonization and taking away of native land. The boarding schools that I'm going to talk about affected Native people. They did not affect my family personally. So as I just said, I really can't claim that I'm speaking for Native people. That's not my intention at all. I'm going to talk about what I call the pieces of the puzzle that I can provide. So as an historian and as an archivist, I can't tell you, what it's like to have had ancestors in these schools. I can't give that perspective, but I can tell you what I've found by reading thousands of pages of microfilm and that sort of thing. And so that is the perspective I'm giving today, is the documented written record, which is going to be a little different than what you would hear from a Native person who had this in their own family. All right, so this is a photograph from Indian Country Today, which is a Native-run media site, and some of you may recognize this sort of headline that's been in the news a lot over the last almost 2 years now. The media started reporting about 2 years ago on the fact that hundreds of unmarked graves were being discovered on the grounds of one of the residential schools in Canada. The first articles that came out were about this school, which is Kamloops Indian School, which is a Catholic school up in British Columbia. In this case, Native families in Canada had, of course, known that many children had gone to the school and disappeared. That was not new knowledge to the tribes. But they did not know necessarily what had happened, like why their children died or where they were buried. What caused the headlines was new evidence, which was found through ground-penetrating radar, which is what this person here is doing, that was done in an orchard next to the school, where they found evidence of hundreds of graves of this particular school, where no markers were left. Very, very disturbing. What is less well known is that schools like that in Canada actually existed all over the place. They existed all across the United States. Similar kinds of schools also existed in Australia. And there are unmarked graves right here in Oregon, not that far from where we are right now. Before we talk in more detail about missing children and these unmarked graves, I want to back up for just a minute and talk about this question here. What were Native American boarding schools? And I think many of you here in the audience already know a little bit of what they were about. But for anyone who doesn't, I want to give just a little bit of background info. All right, so this portrait here, clearly done from a Western perspective, right? And this sort of illustrates the typical story that many of us probably heard in 4th grade when we were learning about the Oregon Trail. This is the narrative that, you know, as the United States was growing and manifest destiny and, you know, the spirit of progress was pushing west, and white people were coming and they were bringing their wagon trains and taking over the land, and the native people were being pushed out. In Oregon and Washington, most tribes by the 1850s were being forced to sign treaties which gave up, in most cases, all or nearly all of their traditional lands. And by 1880, which is when our story of the Forest Grove Indian School is going to pick up, by 1880, most tribes had been pushed onto reservations. So this is a map of the reservations as of 1880. This was understandably not something that was a happy occasion for the tribes, being pushed off their land onto reservations. Some tribes refused to sign treaties and resisted. Some tribes signed the treaties and then the treaties were broken very quickly and they rose up in resistance. Other times, Native people were living on their treaty lands and settlers attacked them and they fought back. There were a lot of different scenarios happened. But what that all led to was that in between the signing of the treaties and the year 1880, many different wars occurred in between the United States and the tribes here in the Pacific Northwest. Just a few of those wars were the Yakima War, the Rogue River Wars, the Modoc War, the Nez Perce War, the Bannock War. There were many. From the point of view of white settlers in the West, Native tribes living on reservations were a threat. And that was a threat that, in the opinion of many people at that time, could only be addressed by the extinction of the tribes. But progressive reformers, including church leaders, some politicians, and even some army officers, were arguing for a different approach. Instead of killing the natives, they said, we could assimilate them. And that philosophy was summed up by this famous quote. This is the founder of the off-reservation federal boarding system in the United States, Captain Pratt. And so this quote here, "Kill the Indian, save the man," sums up that idea that rather than committing literal genocide against Native people, we would commit a kind of cultural genocide. In other words, wiping out everything that is Indian about Indians. And this, of course, could be accomplished through boarding schools. That's the idea. This idea of assimilating tribes got a lot of support at the time. It was promising a lot of things that white settlers wanted, which included an end to all of those wars that we just mentioned, conversions for churches. This was critical. If Native people were assimilated and became farmers, they could take individual allotments of land rather than owning their land in common. And that all of the quote-unquote excess land on the reservations could then be divvied up and handed out to either settlers or other interests, like timber interests. And then finally, by training Native children in trades, you could also have kind of a bank of people who now knew trades but probably weren't going to be paid that well. This system of putting children in boarding schools actually started on reservations. So before the big federal off-reservation schools. There were schools like this on reservations. So this is Puyallup. This is Umatilla. This is a field trip of Grand Ronde children. This is just a small number of photos. There were many more of these schools. The on-reservation schools, though, they had a problem, which was that the students were really close to their families. So if you take a child and put them in the boarding school on the reservation, it's not that far away from home. So let's take Grand Ronde as an example of how this played out. Starting around 1870 at Grand Ronde, so if you all aren't familiar, Grand Ronde is the tribe, the modern tribe today that includes the Kalapuyas, who I believe were the tribe here in Lake Oswego, right? So Grand Ronde, these are the people who are from here. So at Grand Ronde, around 1870, the Catholic Church on the reservation started a day school, and the children were forced to attend the day school. So just like a more or less normal-ish school, day school. But the children were still walking home at the end of the day to their families. And of course, there they were going to be surrounded by Native culture. They would be speaking Native languages, they'd be practicing traditions, and all that. So from the point of view of school administrators, that was not ideal, because the indoctrination they were getting in the school might be getting undone when they went home at night. So in response, they changed it from a day school to a boarding school. And there the children, even though their parents might only live like 3 miles away, would be forced to stay overnight with the Catholic teachers. But still, they were still on the reservation. And if they wanted to run away, which many children did, or if their parents wanted them back, it was a quick run home. So this is what was going on reservations all over the US in the 1870s and into the 1880s, actually. These two systems kind of overlapped. That children on the reservations were running away and going home. That was not ideal from the point of view of the school administrators. So the ultimate solution proposed by people like Pratt, the man who said, kill the Indian, save the man, was this system. So this was the first off-reservation federal boarding school. It was in Pennsylvania, so quite far away from most of the children's homes. These children here were taken from all over the West, so they might be 1,000 miles away from their parents, much, much harder to run. And in addition to that, since they're off the reservation, they're being mixed with children from lots of different tribes, which meant that even if they were trying to hold on to their home language and culture, there was no one to practice it with once they got here. So this is a sort of like a factory mentality for assimilating children. The federal system of off-reservation schools expanded, and there were eventually 25 of these large off-reservation schools. And look at number 2 right here in Oregon. Those off-reservation schools, though, you know, there were 25, and they were big, but there were many more. So this is a list of all known reservation schools that they've been able to track down so far. So about 367 of these schools. And by the 1920s, 4 out of 5 children on reservations were being put in one or another of these schools. So it was a very big system. So the effects of this, you know, being taken out of your home when you're somewhere between 6 and 16, and then staying at a boarding school from somewhere between 3 to 10 plus years, where you're told every day, that your home language should never be spoken, that all of your cultural traditions are bad or backwards, all of those things, that had really, really severe effects on Native families. The full scale of the damage that these schools did to Native communities has never been quantified. It's only now that the US government is actually starting to face up to this past. After many years of calls from tribes and Native political groups for accountability, there is a champion for this cause now in the Department of the Interior. So Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior, is herself Native, and her own family was affected by these schools. So for the last few years, her grandmother, grandfather, and great-grandfather were taken away as children and put into these schools. So she knows firsthand some of the damage that the system did. And she has been directing the Department of the Interior over the last few years to investigate and account for children who died in these schools and to find their burial locations. All right, so that was a very quick overview of kind of the system as a whole. And now I'm going to zoom in a little bit and talk more about what the school here in Oregon was like. All right, so you're going to hear me talk about the Forest Grove Indian School and Chemawa. The reason why I'm talking about both is that the school that is Chemawa was first named Forest Grove, and then it moved after 5 years. So that's the connection there. These two photos here are probably the most famous pair of photos relating to the Forest Grove Indian School. These are in the archives where I work. And what this was intended to show was a before and after of children as they were arriving at the school, and then 7 months later. We can kind of see a lot of what the school is up to just by looking at the photos. I hope that you in the back can see it all right. It's probably a bit small. As children came into these schools, their clothes from home would be taken away. They'd be given military uniforms or work clothes if they were girls. Their hair would be cut. Sometimes their heads were shaved. Girls and boys were separated, so sibling groups were taken apart. And if they didn't already have a Western name, they'd be given a Western name. And then they would be, put in school. We'll talk a bit more in a minute about kind of what the daily life was like. You may notice, looking at these two photos, that there's a different number of children in the two, and the reason why is that one of the children died in between the time that these two were taken. We believe, so we know her name. Her name was Martha Lott. It's also called Maddie Lott. And we believe that she was this girl, the tallest one there. And in between these two, she died of a disease and was buried in Forest Grove. Her grave today does not have a marker. I'm hoping we may have more time at the end to talk about kind of where this is going now, like what the response is now. But just as far as the history, she was buried, and today no marker exists in her grave. This is one of the few photos we have of what the Forest Grove Indian School looked like. This was very early in its history when not quite as many students were there yet. This was probably taken in 1881. But we can still see the superintendent, who was also an Army officer. The boys lined up here with their military uniforms, the girls over here with their work clothes. Girls' dorm, boys' dorm, workshop in the back. I'm the archivist at Pacific, as you heard in the introduction, and so, which is in Forest Grove. and that is my connection to how I got started in this. I came to Pacific in 2011 and came across a box of material very quickly once I got into the archives that had photographs and things from the school. So since soon after my arrival in Forest Grove, I've been working on researching the school. But when I first arrived at Pacific, we actually didn't know a whole lot about what had happened at this school. We knew just really broad strokes. We knew that the school had opened in 1880, and we knew that it had been run by the federal government with some kind of cooperation from the university that I work for. We knew it was located off campus. This photograph here shows girls and boys separated, posed to look as if they're in the academic class, which they would have attended half the day. They're actually outside. If you look at the bottom, it's grass. When I came to Pacific in 2011, we also knew that in 1885 the school had moved from Forest Grove to the new campus, which is north of Salem and named Chemawa. The school that was Forest Grove, it just moved campuses. And when they did that, they renamed it Chemawa. And this is shocking to some people, but the school is actually still open today. If you go down I-5 towards Salem, you may see the sign for Chemawa, and that is where it is. It's on the east side of I-5, north of Salem. It's a very different school now, of course. They don't beat children or force them not to speak their own, none of those things are going on now. But it is still open, which is shocking to a lot of people. So overall, I keep referring back to when I came to Pacific. Overall, 10 years ago, we kind of knew some broad outlines, but we didn't know a whole lot of detail. And that began to change after I met Shauna Hotch. So this woman here. Shauna was a student at Pacific University. She was Native Alaskan. She'd actually just graduated from Chemawa. And when she came to Pacific, she sought me out within just a few weeks of getting to campus and said, I just graduated from Chemawa, and for my civic engagement project, which is like a project that our freshmen usually have to do that, like does some sort of service, she wanted to find the graves of children who had died at the Forest Grove Indian School so that she could clean their graves and pay her respects. And when I heard that, I was like, oh no, because at that time, we did not know how many children had died, what they had died of, or where they were buried. And it had actually, until she asked that question, it had never even occurred to me that, of course, if children had died in Forest Grove, their graves would still be there. So in order to address that lack of information, I hired Shauna to work in the archives. And we started looking into the only piece of documentary evidence that we had about who the children were at that time in my archives was a copy of the school roster. This is a photo of the original. We just had photocopies. So we started going through the photocopies, writing down names, and trying to find out a little bit about each student who went to the school, trying to figure out who was there, who died, how old were they, was the information on this roster accurate? This is all written down by the people running the school. Could we trust what they say? We were looking into all of those questions. We found that during the 5 years that the school was in Forest Grove, there were 310 students enrolled. And this little cloud of words here shows where they came from. The biggest words are the ones where the most students came from, and vice versa. Something kind of interesting about this that you might notice is that, where's Grand Ronde? Grand Ronde is the reservation that represents this area. So why is it not there. It's super tiny right here because only one student from Grand Ronde attended. And this was part of the system of the school, was to take students far away and bring them here. As a side note, I've also just been able to figure out over time through research that Grand Ronde, being Catholic, did not send quite as many students in the early period because the people running the Forest Grove School were Protestants. So the Catholic teachers at Grand Ronde actually resisted sending the children to a Protestant school, but that resistance didn't last. After the school moved to Chemawa, plenty of students from Grand Ronde ended up having to go there. So Shauna and I scanned every document and photo we could find in the archives where I work. We put them all up online, and this work has continued after Shauna left Pacific. So it's been going on for about 10 years. But at the point when Shauna left Pacific, we still hadn't resolved exactly how many children died there or how they died. It turned out to be actually a really difficult question as an historian to solve, because the government has never, well, until Deb Haaland's recent efforts, they've never come out with a list of who died or how many children died in these schools. So it wasn't like we could just ask the National Archives for a list and get it. We had to do a lot of digging. In Martha Lott's case, the girl in the photograph who's missing, we actually found a lot of documentation about her death because she was the daughter of a chief, and she was the first student to die at the school. So there's actually a lot of correspondence in the National Archives about the circumstances of her death. But there was nothing about where she was buried. And so I eventually found I'm also on the board of our local historical society, and some people hooked me up with some old logs from our local cemetery, and there we were able to show for sure that Martha Lott was buried in a plot in our town cemetery. Eventually, we found out a lot more. I don't have time to go through all of the details of all of the things that we found, but this is another student. So Martha Lott was from one of the Spokane tribes, Hugh Victor from Umatilla. And none of these have markers on them. So where did we find the evidence about student deaths? So as I mentioned, Martha Lott was pretty well documented, but many other students weren't. So trying to actually enumerate how many students died in these schools is actually a really hard problem to solve. One of the best sources of information about deaths and burials at the school has turned out to be the school's financial records. So just like a reporter might say, follow the money, that turned out to be true for the school's records as well. And so this is a copy of a ledger, water damaged, but we're still able to kind of read it. And this one tells us the funeral expenses for Martha Lott. For funeral expenses, Indian girl, pupil Martha Lott, including coffin and trimmings for same, coffin box, carriage here, etc. And so since this sounds morbid, but this is in fact where a lot of the documentation comes from. When students died, that was not an expense that was expected, like it wasn't budgeted for in the annual budgets of the school. And so if they purchased a coffin, they had to file, this is a bureaucracy, very, very bureaucratic system. So if they bought a coffin and it wasn't in the budget, there's a file that has that request for reimbursement in the National Archives. And so that is one of the sources that we've drawn on to find out how many students died. We've also looked at lots of other sources. We've looked at diaries and letters and newspapers and lots of school records. And so for the last about 10 years, I've been compiling spreadsheets like these that say the names of students, you know, and then all of the details that we've gathered, including citations to where we found, you know, how they died and where they might be buried. So just talking about the Forest Grove Indian School during that 5 years that it was open, I found evidence of 11, possibly 12 student deaths in school custody, most of which were due to tuberculosis. However, if you count all of the students who died, who enrolled in Forest Grove, then moved to Salem, 40 died in school custody. So that's about 15% of those who enrolled died in school custody. And then an additional percentage died well, if a student got sick, the school would often try to send them home before they died, so that that wouldn't be on their ledger and they wouldn't have to pay for burial expenses. So they would try to send children home. So there were more who died. So it was a very high percentage of students who were dying in school custody. So that only addresses that 5-year period when the school's in Forest Grove. And of course, the school's been in Salem ever since. So for more than 100 years. When the school moved to Chemawa, the conditions in Salem were initially really, really bad. When they brought the students there on a train, and there were no buildings. They had, the first summer that they were in Salem, they had the children building their own shacks to live in for the winter. And even the government's own inspectors, so there are inspection records that are also in the National Archives, government inspectors were shocked and horrified to find the conditions the children were living in that year. The shacks, they said, leaked from every direction. The children were covered in lice. They weren't being fed properly. And meanwhile, they were just packing in more and more children. So under those conditions, it's not all that surprising that a lot more children died. So 11 died during those first 5 years in Forest Grove. But in the first 5 years at Chemawa, 3 times that number died. So it was not a good place to be. As time went on at Chemawa, the physical conditions improved. They built permanent buildings. But the school also got more and more institutional in character. So instead of being one of maybe like 50 children, how it would have been in the first year of the school, now they were one of hundreds of children. I've heard from descendants of alumni who attended Chemawa in the 1920s that for some kids it was a real hell. They didn't have enough blankets, they didn't have enough food. When illnesses got into the school, they would spread. The children were packed in real tight. So like when the Spanish flu came through, around 21 children died within about 3 or 4 month period. And children were contracting all kinds of other things, meningitis, other fevers. Tuberculosis was the big one, though. Up through the 1930s, so between 1885 and mid-1930s, by default, if a child died in school custody, they would be buried in the school cemetery. So that was not the case. In Forest Grove, they were buried in the regular town cemetery, but at Chemawa, they were buried on school grounds. This sign, which dates from 1886, is still there on the grounds of the cemetery at Chemawa. So I just want to acknowledge at this point, most of my research that I've been doing has been on that very early period, first 5 years of the school. But along the way, I've met up with a lot of other people who are also researching the school. So I just want to acknowledge here that I'm not working like in a vacuum or doing all of this all by myself. There's a lot of other people involved. Sue Ann Reddick has been extremely helpful to me. She's an historian of Chemawa. She worked there in the 90s. And she's been working on issues surrounding student deaths for quite a long time now, over 20 years. So she and I have been combining our research and trying to fill in gaps for each other. Now, Sue Ann is one of the few people who's been published in peer-reviewed journals on the history of Chemawa. So when all of that news came out a few years ago about the residential schools in Canada and unmarked graves, Sue Ann started to get phone calls from reporters asking what she knew about unmarked graves here in Oregon. People were wondering if maybe there might be a few hundred unmarked graves at Chemawa. And this suspicion has been around actually for quite a long time, like predating the discoveries in Canada. This is a photo from 2013 of Marcia Small, who's been allowed to do ground-penetrating radar work at the Chemawa Cemetery. So she has been finding, for about 10 years now, evidence that there are many more graves at the Chemawa Cemetery than there are markers for. So this was a known issue. But Sue Ann and I were concerned about how this might turn out, like how it might be reported. Like if the Statesman Journal, for example, just went to the website Find a Grave, which has an entry for the Chemawa Cemetery, and just printed out what Find a Grave says about who's buried there, they would get a very distorted view of who's actually buried there. We thought that that would understate the total number of deaths significantly. On the other hand, if they just speculated and they said, no one knows anything about who's buried there, who knows how many, that too would do a disservice, basically, to Native families, because we did not think that there were hundreds. We don't think hundreds. Dozens, maybe. Hundreds, no. So we also had name and date corrections on a lot of the information that's out there on sites like Find a Grave. Basically, we wanted to be sure that what information was being published by the media reflected what historians know, rather than sort of like speculating. So we decided, Sue Ann and I had been working on this for a combined total of something like 30 years. And we thought we should, but we hadn't published it. So we knew a lot of things in our spreadsheets that the Native community didn't have access to, that the public didn't necessarily know about. So we decided to pull together the information we had gathered and publish it on a website. And we didn't, as I just said, we didn't do that all by ourselves or in a vacuum. Sue Ann has been connected to the Chemawa community since the 90s. She volunteered there for many years. And so as we embarked on this idea of publishing information about student deaths at Chemawa, we checked in with alumni of Chemawa. We checked in with other Native connections that we had. And of course, Native communities are complicated. It's not like all Native people have the same opinion, obviously, about everything. And so while we can't be sure that that everyone would agree, we had enough input from Native people to feel pretty confident that publishing this information would be respectful and useful to members of the community. And on top of that, having all these deaths documented through the kind of evidence that I can provide helps basically complement the information that Native people have been providing for a long time. So as a result, we published this website with all the information that we could pull together responsibly within a short time frame. And we came up with what we think is the clearest count yet of how many students died in custody of the school pre-World War II, which is 270 children. Much higher. Sometimes I get the question, well, didn't a lot of children die young in those days? Well, they did, but usually a lot of child mortality was children who were like under 6. Children older than 6 didn't die in those kinds of numbers back then. And if this had been happening at like a white boarding school, you can bet that the white families would be pulling their children out. So this website provided the best evidence that we have of who died. We have their names. We have, for many of the children, the reported cause of death. We have grave locations for many of the students, though not all. One of the things we found is that, so this is a transcription of the plot map of graves at Chemawa, and we found that there was this kind of strange blank area on the map, and corresponding to a time period in the 1890s. Well, we think that children are in every one of those spots, and we think there's a possibility that we could match up students who we know died during that time period, but have no known grave location. There might be a possibility of basically facilitating, if tribes want it, some sort of DNA matching. I'm going to kind of skip through the next few slides just in the interest of time, because I think I'm already past my 40-minute mark. But just to go through this very quickly, we've been trying to piece together, the reasons why Chemawa Cemetery has so many unmarked graves. And so we have some hypotheses about that. I'm going to skip through what those hypotheses are, but if you're interested, I'd be very happy to talk about it after the talk. I have this slide in here just to acknowledge, I've been talking about this all in a pretty dry fashion, just naming numbers, a few names, a few tribes. I just want to acknowledge here that this work is super hard, and for every child who's on the spreadsheets that I've been talking about, each row in the spreadsheet is a child. It's somebody's life, somebody's son or daughter, and that's a really hard thing as an historian to kind of grapple with. After publishing that site, Deaths at Chemawa, I took a break from working on the school's history for a while because I was like, I can't look at any more, spreadsheets of dead children for a while. So for it to affect somebody like me, where this is not in my family, these aren't my ancestors, but it's hard to see it, right? So for Native people who do this work, I am really in awe that they're able to have the strength and sustain and not just be, so affected by the work that they can't go on. It's pretty amazing that so many Native people have persisted in calling for accountability. All right, I'm going to skip through a little bit here so that we can talk about what can we do about this. The first thing I want to just note is that when I first started hearing from Shauna and figuring out that there were so many children who had unmarked graves, my first instinct was to go out and fix the problem. To go out and put markers on graves, or to put up memorials or whatever. And something that's become very clear to me in talking with a lot of Native people is that is absolutely not my place. That these decisions about whether to mark graves, whether to repatriate remains, whether to do anything, are decisions that need to be made by the tribes. So I just want to put that out there first because that's usually one of the first suggestions. So Tribes are working on this right now, and I expect within the next year or two, we actually will see more investigations being done into unmarked graves. That's all I can say about that at this point. What else can we do? Well, we're going to have a little question and answer session in a minute here, but just to put out a couple of ideas. Well, we could put our individual votes and things behind supporting Native sovereignty. So these schools, the intention behind them was to wipe out Native culture and wipe out Native political power. The idea was to break apart the reservations, right? So by supporting Native sovereignty, we can directly oppose what these schools were intended to do. We can do the same thing with Native culture by supporting like Native artists, Native cultural events. A lot of tribes hold events that are open to the public. You don't have to be Native to go. And so that's a great way actually to support Native people, is to like help the culture live, help support living artists, not just think about what happened 100 years ago, but think about people alive today. And then another way, sometimes people ask, is there anywhere I can donate? And so I have this slide just with a few suggestions. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is the big national charity that supports survivors, like living survivors of the system. I guess I didn't mention through this whole talk that this system of trying to eradicate Native culture kept going through the 1960s. So there's plenty of people alive today who went to these types of schools. So this is the organization that really works to support them and is working very hard on documenting deaths. This is more local. I donate here to the Native American Youth and Family Center in Portland, which supports children from all tribes, all Native people living in Portland. And then, of course, specific tribal cultural centers are another great way to support. All right, so to take a breath. That was a pretty heavy talk, and I'm hoping now that we can have a little time to take questions. And what I'll do, just because we're being filmed, is I'll repeat back what you said, and my hearing is not great, just FYI, so you may have to talk loud. Yes?
I missed whether you said Chemawa was still functioning as a boarding school.
Yes, so the question...
How many students do they have?
Okay, so the question was, is Chemawa still functioning as a boarding school, and how many students do they have? It is still functioning as a boarding school. It's still open. It has a very different mission now. It is no longer trying to assimilate Native children into white society. It is trying to support Native cultures, so children who go there are in an all-Native environment. And there's a lot of support for Native cultures and languages and all of these things. It still has its share of problems. So Shauna, whose picture I had up on the screen earlier, she graduated from Chemawa. And she actually had a pretty good experience there. So a lot of what I know is like colored by what Shauna has told me. But my understanding is that it has problems, but is still a good place for a lot of Native people today. That's the impression I've got. And as far as how many students are there, I think it's a few hundred, but I couldn't tell you the exact number.
So who decides who goes there? And how do they get enrolled there?
All right, so I am definitely not an expert on modern day Chemawa. So take what I'm about to say like with a grain of salt, because I'm a historian. But so from what Shauna told me, at the time when she was there, she graduated around 2012, I think. At the time that she was there, around half the students had like wanted to come and put in an application to come, including Shauna. So Shauna I don't want to tell too much about her personal life, but she came from a very, very small village. And she told me that, if she had gone to high school in her home village, there'd be like 2 people in her high school. And so she came to Chemawa, and for her, part of why it was a good experience is that she met Native kids from all over the United States and made a lot of connections, like intertribal connections. But the other half of the students, when she was there, had some sort of problem at home and had been either like highly encouraged or sort of told that they should go to Chemawa. So that was like, at this point, 12 years ago. That information is about 12 years old. And from what I understand, they've been trying to move more and more towards fully volunteer enrollment and away from kind of, oh, you're having some problems with the law or whatever at home, and let's send you to a boarding school. I don't think that's what they want to do now. But again, historian, not an expert on current Chemawa. Yes?
As a historian, I might have missed this part. Why did they move from Forest Grove to Chemawa?
Yes, I actually did not get into that because it's a long story, but I'll try to boil it down real quick. One of the main points of the Forest Grove Indian School was to turn kids into farmers, which was connected to that whole project of splitting up land on the reservations, right? So when the Forest Grove Indian School started, there's a whole backstory to why it happened this way. But the land for the Forest Grove Indian School was donated to the federal government by Pacific University. It wasn't on our campus. It was about 3 or 4 blocks off campus from Pacific University, just like some land in town that Pacific happened to own. They donated it. It was a residential block in the middle of town. It didn't have farmland. It was about 4 acres. And so when the second superintendent arrived at the school, he right away started complaining to the Secretary of the Interior, saying, I'm supposed to be teaching these kids farming, but we don't have any land. What they were doing was using the children as sharecroppers. They would send out the children to area farms, and the work they did on the farm was the rent for the land that they were farming. And so that was not ideal in the eyes of the Department of the Interior. So they essentially, I'm trying to boil this down, but what essentially happened is that there was almost like a public bidding process where they advertised in the newspapers saying, does anybody have a good section of land that they're willing to donate to the government? And if you do, it's a little bit like today how a small town might try to get a federal prison located nearby, because it comes with federal money. In those days, a $30,000 a year budget was quite something. And so business people in Salem basically said, yes, we will do that. They came up with some land, but it was all about the farming was really the root of it. Yes?
The government of Canada has apologized to, has the US done anything similar? And second, just an observation, recently I think the World Court indicted Putin and one of his, I forget, secretaries of family or family services, something, for doing something similar with Ukrainian children.
Oh, really?
They've been removed forcibly by from their families to Russia, and they're also in re-education camps, and they have been indicted as war criminals.
Yes.
So I just wanted to bring that up.
So just to paraphrase, there was a comment that something similar even today is happening in Ukraine, which I don't know about that, but I fully believe what you were saying. And then the other part of the question was, I just lost it. It just went out of my head.
Canada apologized.
Oh, yes.
To the government of Canada.
Right. So, yes, Canada has apologized. What Deb Howland is doing right now in the Department of the Interior, she has this program called The Road to Healing, where she's visiting different areas of the country with large Native populations and listening. And so I don't know if that means that that's leading up to an official apology. There has been a report that's come out of that process already, which is very interesting. If you Google it, You can probably find it. I can't remember the title, but it's like Department of the Interior report on boarding schools. You would find it. And so there is stuff in there that talks about the history and acknowledges it, but as far as like, you know, the president getting up and actually giving an apology, that has not happened. I think I'm getting the signal that we need to wrap up our time. Is that correct?
That was repeat the question.
Okay. All right. Do we have a few more minutes? This sort of looks like wrap it up to me. So we might have a few more minutes. Yes?
As a historian, if the Department of Interior initiated the schools, but there was such a list of the various denominations, who made those choices of sending which children to which schools? Because that religious denomination certainly was going to have some kind of trickle-down effect for the denomination or the children of the tribe.
Yes. So the question is, with such a long list of boarding schools that we saw on that one slide, who actually decided where children would be sent? And I'm guessing, you know, how did they decide? So I don't know that the historical groundwork has been fully fleshed out on this yet. The full scale of the problem is like only now being revealed. And though there have been several books published on kind of like the top level of the system, and also some books on individual on-reservation schools, I don't think there's been kind of like the historical synthesis yet that really truly answers that question. But I'll try to give you like my sort of hypothesis based on what I've seen. What I can tell about how students were being taken to Forest Grove and Chemawa in the early years, in the very early years, they didn't have the bureaucratic systems that would be developed later to like automatically funnel children from tribes to the schools. The school superintendents of the off-reservation schools had to write to the people in charge of the reservations. So there's sort of like tiers. On the reservation, almost every reservation had an on-reservation school, one or more. So like Warm Springs had 2, Grand Ronde had 1, etc. The children were all supposed to be going to the on-reservation school. Sometimes they might go to a religious school instead. Sometimes the reservation school was sort of a government/church collaboration. But anyway, students were supposed to be going to the on-reservation school, and then they would often get pulled out. This seems to be the most common source of students for the federal off-reservation schools, is that students would have already enrolled on the reservation, then they'd be sort of plucked out and moved to the federal off-reservation system. I don't know if I answered that super well, but
Sounds like a very complicated thing.
it is complicated, and there's more complexities around religion that I don't think we have enough time to get into, but most reservations had some sort of denominational connection because of, there was something under President Grant, he actually assigned reservations to denominations.
Thank you.
Yeah. On the back, I think you were first.
I had 2 questions. My first one was, do you have any knowledge of when the Department of Interior absorbed the Indian Bureau of Affairs? And then my second is, how does your work correspond with the call to action that Senator Wyden has implemented in the last few years?
You may have to tell me a little bit more about the call to action that you're...
I think after the Canadian school information started coming out, he had called for an investigation into Chemawa specifically, just because that's the one within his district.
Okay. Yeah, so the second part of the question was with Ron Wyden calling for accountability for Chemawa. I think that may have something to do with the graves, but there's a bigger kind of underlying questions about Chemawa that are kind of out of my purview about, you know, how is Chemawa being run? Is it providing appropriate education to children who go there now? from what I understand, and again, I feel a little uncomfortable addressing some of these questions. It's just, I only know like what I read in news articles. So.
Wonder if your specific work had anything to do with his call to action, which you have answered. So.
Yeah. And then as far as the Department of the Interior, when did it absorb what is now the Bureau of Indian Affairs? It is before the time period that I am addressing, so I haven't gotten super into that, but I would just kind of ballpark it as 1870s, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Yeah. Oh, wait, sorry, you were first.
Are there also records of some of the parents either protesting this or finding their children, trying to find their children? Does that show up at all in the archive?
So during the very early period that I focused on in the 1880s, at that point, most of the children in the school, a lot of their parents didn't speak English and didn't read or write. And so we can't find their words in the written record because they didn't write. But for later periods, yes. And there are, even in the 1880s, there are traces of it. The correspondence files of the superintendents of the schools still exist. They're kind of patchy. There's like gaps. But we can see often at least the outgoing correspondence, the school side of it, if not the incoming side. So I can see in the 1880s that there were parents who were probably through interpreters and people writing letters for them, asking questions. In the 20th century, when the system was much bigger and a lot more institutionalized and bureaucratic, there were a lot more complaints, and a lot more of those things were saved and are still in the archives. So the answer in brief is yes, they did complain. Mm-hmm. And I think you were next.
You know, religious affiliation. You mentioned that President Grant would divide between different denominations.
Mm-hmm.
But anything I've ever seen on this always seems to focus on the Roman Catholic Church. It focuses on the Roman Catholic Church in the United States, in Canada, in Ireland, and in other areas where that seems to be a very, very powerful influence, almost to the point of being kind of like an underworld. This is where you will be, and this is what will happen. I've even seen reports where the name of the religion has been avoided, maybe on purpose, maybe by accident. But when the child, as a man who's, say, 44 years old, says that the nun made me eat my own vomit, I'm assuming that was a Roman Catholic facility. So who had the lion's share of this and why?
So the lion's share is probably the government itself, for all of the schools that were run, by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is under the Department of the Interior. Government itself is probably number one. I think Catholics show up more, partly because they're one of the biggest denominations, just in terms of how big the church is and how many schools they ran. But I wouldn't say that the Catholics were necessarily better or worse. There were a lot of Protestant denominations who did equally bad things. Some of the Protestant denominations that were involved in this were the Presbyterians, Quakers, Congregationalists, Methodists, I think Baptists. There were a lot of the mainline denominations were involved. I think it's just that the Catholic Church is much bigger than any of those individual denominations, and that's why we hear about them more. That's my feeling. Yes?
Referencing his question, if I'm not mistaken, one of the superintendents at Forest Grove was actually a Quaker. Right. But going on, when did they expect the children to graduate out of these schools, at what age? And do you have any clue about how many actually, quote, successfully graduated from Pacific?
From Pacific or from?
Coming Forest Grove.
Okay, so the question was, how long were students in the school for, and how many graduated? So this changes a lot. Like, I keep repeating this, but things in the period that I've been researching in the 1880s are going to be really different than the case in the 1920s, right? So in the 1880s, when the system was just starting and was in its least institutionalized state, the very beginning, what they told the students' families was that they would be there for 3 years. And in those very early years, they often took older students. So like when we saw that picture of the campus and all the students lined up, a lot of the students in that photo are teenagers or even young adults with only a relatively smaller number of young children. That quickly changed. They wanted to get more and more numbers because their budgets were tied to how many students were enrolled. So they started getting younger and younger students and then recommending that they be held for longer and longer periods of time. So by 1885, they were telling parents that it would probably be more like 5 years. And then in fact, when I check and see how long individual students stayed, it stretches out. Like they might have been told 5 years, but very often they were there for 8 years, 9 years. And then over time, the norm by the 1920s, I think, for a lot of students was that they would be taken around age 6 and then leave when they graduated high school, which might be 16, 17, or 18. Graduating is a tricky thing to address. I don't have a nice percentage for you. Graduating from the Forest Grove Indian School was sort of like graduating from 8th grade. It wasn't really, at that time, it was more like middle school level curriculum, not high school. But every year they kind of increased which grades they were having in the school, and so later, when students graduated, it would have been like equivalent to high school. So anyway, I'm not giving you a very good answer. It's basically, the answer is like it changed over time, and that students were kept for longer and longer periods. Yes?
You showed one slide towards the end where you spoke about the emotional impact of this work on you, and then you also admired Native researchers who have persisted in this work. On the flip side of it, this was part of a plethora of racist social and public policy, and that Native, there's a body of research on historical trauma, and how this historical trauma has been passed down,
Yes.
and to this day affects the health and well-being of large numbers of I just wanted to.
Yes, what you're saying, so just to paraphrase, she's talking about how a lot of research has been done, and I might be putting words in your mouth, but not just historical research, but like, social sciences research in the present day on trauma and how it gets passed down through generations and how that affects people, and that's absolutely true. Bringing up Shauna Hotch again, the woman on the slide, she ended up, like when she left Pacific, she went on and got a master's in public health. And we're working together actually on presentations for the Indian Health Service on kind of how the history intersects with the public health aspects. So it's a very current topic and one that I think a lot more research is going to be published on.
And that this was just one in a whole group of social and public policy.
Yes, I should, that as well.
To erase the culture.
That this was not only the only thing that was happening that affected Native culture. Yes, very good points. Yes?
Yeah, I did support an Indian school for a while, well, quite a while. And somebody told me, a very trusted individual who'd been involved with development and raising money, said, you want to be careful supporting Indian schools because you never quite know what's going on. And I said, well, I'll find out what the background of this particular school is. I haven't done it yet. How checked with charities, and they say, like Charity Navigator, well, that's not in our purview. We wouldn't do that. We tell you about the Oxfam or CARE.
Right.
But we don't tell you about the school. So do you go to the Department of the Interior? Do you say, this specific school, has it got a record of abusing its students? Has it got a, on the other side, you don't just have to look for train wrecks. Have they graduated students? Have the students said this was a wonderful experience for me? And I'd like to come up with a way to do that.
So to try to paraphrase, the question was about if we wanted to support students in current day schools, Native American schools, how can we find out whether the schools now are worth supporting? Is that?
Pretty much.
Okay. So I probably don't have a great answer for that. There is a reason why, you know, when I put up the slide about where to donate, I didn't say donate directly to Chemawa. And it's not that, I mean, there are a lot of dedicated teachers, a lot of dedicated people working there, but I would feel personally a little uncomfortable with donating to the institution.
So something that said, a lot of schools will get together and you'll get all kinds of native art and all.
Yeah.
That's been mass produced in China. Shipped in and then distributed to suckers, really, to make sure they're feeling that they're doing something really great, and then they keep sending in the money. That really gets under my skin.
I think if we want to try to support students that are in schools like these, there are ways where you can kind of be more direct, so you're not just giving money to kind of a faceless institution and then saying, I hope they do a good job. Places like Grand Ronde have things like powwows where the students actually perform. When you buy native goods, native art, you want to make sure that you're buying actually from an authorized source and not from like somebody just mass producing things out of a factory and importing it. There are laws around that you're not supposed to represent yourself as native and sell art that is native, but I see it all the time, especially on Facebook. Places promoting themselves as if they were native when they're really... It sounds like the library is closing.
Can we... Excellent questions and such a fantastic presentation. Can we give her a round of applause? Thank you.
Thanks for having me.